The classroom was silent. 200 people sat in front of Margaret Thompson. Former students, teachers, parents, and school staff. They came to celebrate her retirement. 30 years of teaching. 30 years of sacrifice. 30 years of love. The walls were decorated with colorful banners. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. You changed our lives. We will miss you." Tables were filled with flowers, cakes, and gifts. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was happy. Margaret stood at the front of the room. She wore a simple blue dress and a silver necklace. Her gray hair was tied back. Her hands held a piece of paper. On that paper was her speech, a speech someone else had written for her. The principal, Mr. Harris, walked to the microphone. He was a tall man with glasses and a warm smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "today we honor a legend. Mrs. Margaret Thompson has been teaching at Lincoln High School for 3 decades. She taught English, history, and literature. She inspired thousands of students. She gave her heart to this school." Everyone clapped. Some people stood up. Margaret smiled, but her heart was beating fast. Mr. Harris continued, "Margaret, you are more than a teacher. You are a mother, a guide, a friend. You never gave up on any student. You believed in them, even when they did not believe in themselves." More applause. Margaret's eyes became wet. She tried to hold back her tears. "And now," Mr. Harris said, "Mrs. Thompson will say a few words." He handed her the microphone. The room went quiet again. Everyone waited. Everyone watched. Margaret looked down at the paper in her hands. Her fingers were shaking. She tried to focus on the words, but the letters looked blurry. They looked like black lines dancing on white paper. She could not read a single word. Her throat felt dry. Her chest felt heavy. This was the moment she had feared for 30 years, the moment when her secret would be exposed. She could pretend. She could say, "I forgot my glasses." She could make a joke and avoid reading. She had done it 1,000 times before. But today was different. Today, she was tired of hiding, tired of pretending, tired of living in fear. Margaret took a deep breath. She placed the paper on the table. She looked at the crowd. 200 faces, 200 pairs of eyes. And then she said something nobody expected. "I have a confession to make." The room stayed silent. People leaned forward. Some looked confused. Others looked curious. Margaret's voice was soft but clear. "For 30 years, she said, I stood in this school as a teacher. I taught your children. I graded their papers. I gave them advice. I helped them grow." She paused. Her hands were still shaking. "But there is something you don't know, something I have kept hidden my entire life." A whisper spread through the crowd. Margaret could feel the tension rising. "I cannot read." For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if time had stopped. Then slowly, people began to react. Some gasped, some frowned, some shook their heads in disbelief. A young woman in the front row whispered, "That's impossible." Margaret smiled sadly. "I know it sounds impossible, but it is true. I never learned how to read. Not as a child, not as a teenager, not even as an adult." Mr. Harris stepped forward. "Margaret, I don't understand. How did I teach?" Margaret interrupted. "How did I grade essays? How did I survive for 30 years? She looked around the room. "Let me tell you my story. I was born in a small town," Margaret began. "My family was very poor. My father worked in a factory. My mother cleaned houses. We had 7 children. I was the youngest. When I was 6 years old, I started school. But I was different from other children. When the teacher wrote letters on the board, I could not understand them. When she asked me to read aloud, the words looked like puzzles. My teacher said I was lazy. My father said I was slow. My classmates laughed at me. Every day, school became more painful. By the time I was 10, I stopped going. My parents did not stop me. They needed me to work, so I stayed home. I helped my mother. I took care of my brothers and sisters. I grew up without learning to read, but I was not stupid. I was smart in other ways. I listened carefully. I remembered everything people said. I watched. I learned by hearing, not by reading. Margaret paused. Some people in the crowd had tears in their eyes. When I was 18, she continued, I got a job as a cleaner at a hospital. I worked hard. I was kind to everyone. And I learned something important. I learned that you don't need to read to be a good person. You don't need to read to care about others. You don't need to read to have value. But deep inside, I was ashamed. I felt like I was broken. I felt like I was less than everyone else. One day, when I was 37 years old, something happened. Margaret's voice became stronger now. She was no longer afraid. I was cleaning a classroom at Lincoln High School. It was late in the evening. Most teachers had gone home. But one teacher, Mrs. Eleanor White, was still there. She was grading papers. She looked tired. I asked her if she needed help. She smiled and said, You're very kind, Margaret. I wish I had more helpers like you. Then she said something that changed my life. She said, You know, Margaret, you would make a great teacher. You have a kind heart, and that is the most important thing. I laughed. I told her, I'm just a cleaner. I could never be a teacher. But Mrs. White looked at me seriously. She said, Why not? You're smart. You care about people. That's all you need. I didn't tell her the truth. I didn't tell her I couldn't read. But her words stayed in my mind. That night, I went home and thought about it. Could I really become a teacher? Was it possible? And then I remembered something my grandmother once told me. She said, If you want something badly enough, you will find a way. So I made a plan. I knew I couldn't learn to read overnight. My brain didn't work that way. So I decided to do something different. I would teach without reading. I know it sounds crazy, but I had been surviving my whole life without reading. I could do this too. First, I went to the library. I listened to audiobooks. I memorized entire lessons. I listened to history stories, English grammar rules, and literature summaries. I listened for hours every day. Then I watched teachers. I observed how they moved, how they spoke, how they managed students. I copied their methods. I also found a young college student named Anna. I paid her to help me. I told her I had poor eyesight. I asked her to read textbooks aloud to me. I recorded everything. I listened to those recordings hundreds of times. After 1 year of preparation, I applied for a teaching assistant position at Lincoln High School. Mrs. White recommended me. I got the job. And slowly, step by step, I became a teacher. Teaching without reading was not easy. Every single day was a challenge. When students turned in essays, I could not read them. So I developed a system. I asked students to read their essays aloud in class. I called it presentation practice. They thought it was a teaching method, but it was my survival strategy. When I needed to grade papers, I looked at handwriting, length, and effort. I gave feedback based on what students said in class, not what they wrote on paper. When I had to write on the board, I memorized sentences beforehand, or I asked students to write. I told them, teaching is about learning together. When parents asked me about their child's progress, I spoke about behavior, participation, and attitude. I never mentioned specific written work. I lived in constant fear that someone would discover my secret, fear that I would be exposed as a fraud, fear that I would lose everything. But I kept going because I loved teaching. I loved my students, and they loved me. Over the years, I taught thousands of students. I remember so many of them. There was David, a shy boy who never spoke in class. I encouraged him every day. I told him his voice mattered. Today, he is a lawyer. There was Maria, a girl from a poor family like mine. She wanted to quit school. I convinced her to stay. I told her, Your background does not define your future. Today, she is a doctor. There was James, a troublemaker who everyone gave up on. I didn't. I saw his potential. I believed in him. Today, he is a teacher, just like me. I could not read their essays, but I could see their hearts. I could hear their dreams. I could feel their pain. And that is what made me a good teacher. Not the books I read, not the grades I gave, but the love I showed. So why am I telling you this now? Why am I confessing my secret after 30 years? Margaret's voice cracked with emotion. Because I am tired of hiding. Because I want you to know the truth. Because I want to teach you one final lesson. You don't need to be perfect to be valuable. You don't need to have everything figured out to make a difference. You don't need to be like everyone else to be loved. I was broken. I was scared. I was hiding, but I still gave everything I had. And that was enough. Some of you might feel betrayed. Some of you might think I was a fraud, and maybe you're right. But I want you to know this. Every word of encouragement I gave you was real. Every moment I spent believing in you was true. Every tear I cried for your success came from my heart. I could not read, but I could love, and love is the greatest lesson of all. The room was completely silent. Some people were crying, others sat frozen, trying to process what they had just heard. Then slowly, one person stood up. It was Maria, the doctor, the girl Margaret had encouraged years ago. "Mrs. Thompson," Maria said, her voice shaking, "you saved my life. You told me I could be more than my circumstances. You believed in me when no one else did." She wiped her tears. "I don't care that you couldn't read. You taught me something more important. You taught me to never give up." Another person stood, then another, and another. David, the lawyer, spoke next. "You changed me, Mrs. Thompson. You gave me confidence. You made me believe in myself." James, the teacher, stepped forward. "You are the reason I became a teacher. You showed me that teaching is about the heart, not just the mind." One by one, people began to clap, slowly at first, then louder. Soon, the entire room was standing. 200 people, applauding, crying, smiling. Margaret covered her face with her hands. She could not hold back her tears anymore. Mr. Harris walked over to her. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Margaret," he said softly, "you are not a fraud. You are a hero. You did the impossible. You taught without reading. But more than that, you taught us what real strength looks like." Margaret wiped her tears. She looked at the crowd one last time. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for loving me, even when I was imperfect." She took a deep breath. "If there is one thing I want you to remember, it is this. Your limitations do not define you. Your courage does." I lived in fear for 30 years, but I refused to let that fear stop me from helping others. So whatever challenge you are facing, whatever secret you are hiding, whatever fear is holding you back, let it go. Be brave. Be honest. Be yourself. Because the world doesn't need perfect people. The world needs real people. People who try, people who care, people who love. And that is the greatest lesson I ever learned. After the ceremony, many former students came to hug Margaret. They thanked her. They cried with her. They told her she was their hero. Later that evening, Margaret sat alone in her small apartment. She looked at the flowers and cards people had given her. One card caught her attention. It was from Anna, the college student who had helped her all those years ago. Inside, it said, "Mrs. Thompson, I always knew you couldn't read, but I also knew you had the biggest heart I'd ever seen. Thank you for teaching me that love is more powerful than knowledge." Margaret smiled. She placed the card on her shelf. She had lived 30 years with a secret, but today, she was finally free. Free to be herself, free to be imperfect, free to be loved, and that was more than enough.